sativa, indica, and ruderalis. And for sake of today's conversation, we can pretty much cross off ruderalis. It's not often consumed, and components of ruderalis are not often consumed for medicinal or recreational purposes. Let's focus on sativa and indica. People will consume the sativa variety of cannabis either by edible or by smoking cannabis, or they will consume the indica variety of cannabis, again, by edible or by smoking cannabis, or sometimes they will take it in a transdermal form or a sublingual form. There are a bunch of different ways to get the cannabis into the body, but there's a clear distinction between sativa and indica that actually shows up first in the structure of the plant. At their extremes, meaning in a pure strain of sativa, it tends to be a taller plant, a longer stalk, believe it or not, and actually the length of the leaves is quite a bit longer. Whereas the indica plant tends to be more short and stout. And for those aficionados out there, I'm sure you know a lot of the other specific features of sativa versus indica. But already what we're talking about is the same plant, cannabis, with two very different morphologies or shapes. You might say, well, why is this interesting or important to how it affects me or affects other people for medicinal or recreational purposes? Well, it turns out that even though they are the same plant, these two different genetic varieties, because of the way that they grow and the way they capture sunlight and the way, believe it or not, that the different plants within that strain interact with one another, because believe it or not, plants are interacting with one another, they actually bring different elements of the psychoactive compounds to different components within the leaves and the so-called buds. The takeaway is that when consumed, and when I say consumed, I want to be very clear, I don't necessarily just mean oral consumption or eating cannabis sativa by edible. I also mean smoking it, and that could be, people will, just like with tobacco, the way that they bring the psychoactive components into their bloodstream and into their brain and body is to essentially heat the dried leaves of the cannabis plant. Then the heat liberates some of the psychoactive components that when inhaled into the lungs, because the lungs include a lot of vasculature, a lot of basically blood vessels and capillaries, that the psychoactive components are actually directly absorbed from the lungs into the bloodstream and then can cross into the bloodstream and permeate throughout the body and cross the so-called blood-brain barrier. So in other words, burning the plant liberates the smoke that contains the psychoactive compounds, and those are inhaled into the lungs and then get into the brain and body and act on the brain and body. And the major effect of sativa varieties are to create a high, if you will, and I'm putting this in air quotes for those of you that are listening, but to also act as a stimulant. The sativa varieties tend to make people feel kind of invigorated, somewhat alert. It doesn't tend to be as much of a sedative as some of the other varieties. Some people report heightened sense of focus or heightened sense of creativity. We'll talk a little bit later on as to whether or not they actually are achieving heightened levels of focus and creativity, or whether or not they just perceive themselves to have heightened levels of focus and creativity. The sativa varieties tend to make people feel a little bit less susceptible to pain and noxious stimuli, which are basically stimuli that you don't like. So the sativa varieties are often prescribed or are used in the recreational context for pain management and relief. Basically, the sativa variety is known to include a sort of head-biased effect. So here we're talking about subjective effects, and of course these will vary from one individual to the next. Some people will smoke cannabis sativa or ingest cannabis sativa orally and will feel an entirely different array of effects. But most people, the majority of people, experience a sort of head-centered high alertness, focus, and a sense that they're more creative. Contrast that with the indica varieties of cannabis. And when people smoke or eat or ingest indica varieties, the psychoactive components of indica, and again, this is pure indica, so not hybridized with sativa at all, but just pure indica, tend to lead to more full-bodied effects. People report feeling more complete full-body relaxation, more of a sedative effect. Indica cannabis is often prescribed and or used recreationally in order to achieve a state of sleep or to help relieve anxiety, so less of a stimulant effect. And we will talk about why, literally the underlying neural circuits that lead to the sativa variety causing more of a elevated mood and a head high, if you will, and the indica varieties being more full body relaxation. One of the ways to remember the distinction between the effects of cannabis sativa and cannabis indica was relayed to me by a friend who actually was a chronic, meaning every day, all day, consumer of marijuana. He basically smoked marijuana for 20 years before quitting about 4 or 5 years ago. And he said that indica is often referred to as in the couch, meaning laid back in the couch. And that can help you remember that the indica varieties of cannabis do tend to be more sedative in their effects. Okay, so there's sativa and there's indica, and then now there are hybrid strains. So marijuana